Thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to get to know you all better, to share a little bit of my work, and thanks so much, Sarah, for inviting me and facilitating all of this. I am going to start sharing my screen and hoping for the best here. Um, all right, I think we're good.
Perfect.
So, as was said, I'm an assistant professor at the environmental studies program. And today I'll be focusing on broadly my work associated with climate change, social capital, and livelihoods in these conservation landscapes. And I'll talk a bit more about what I mean when I use that term. And then also at the end, I think I'll have time to talk a bit about some of the work I'm doing, the JEDI work, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion in this space. So just to outline, I'll talk a bit about global change and livelihoods, conservation landscapes for a broader context, then focus on two case studies from Southern Africa and East Africa, looking at some of the linkages between those different features, and then talk a little bit about my work in JEDI and STEM. I will start by acknowledging the many organizations, collaborators, students, faculty, translators, institutions, right? There's so many people who, and so many organizations that support the research that I do. Far too many names to name. So these are some of the organizations that I'm working with. And you'll notice CSU's logo is there because some of the research that I'll be presenting with today, presenting on today, I've been working on with Dr. John Salerno, who's at CSU. And Ryan Bridges, an undergraduate as well. So I will name them directly. So global change processes, in particular climate change and land use change, have really significant impacts on essentially every facet of human life. Human well-being and survival, particularly for the most vulnerable among us, are intrinsically linked to these global change processes. And it's really critical that we understand how we impact climate change and how climate change impacts us. So my work often focuses on climate change and changing climatic systems, specifically drought. And this is actually headlines that I use in a slide for the course that I teach to really exemplify the nature and the severity of drought. These are all headlines from the New York Times, from all over the world, highlighting challenges associated with water and access to water. And so I tend to focus my research on that for a number of reasons. For one, the impacts of climate change are especially pronounced when it comes to smallholder farmers in low and middle income countries who tend to disproportionately bear the burden of the negative impacts from climate change and will continue to do so as it intensifies. So when climate change impacts these communities, particularly in the form of drought, but also in the form of broadly changing climates and things like flooding as well, crops fail, livestock dies, livelihoods are overturned, folks might migrate. The impacts can be quite severe. So understanding how folks are responding to these changes is critical for supporting resilient strategies for adaptation. The need to understand these relationships with global climate change is particularly important for smallholder farmers. Smallholder farmers are those that typically support a single family with a mixture of cash and subsistence crops. And smallholders represent a really significant proportion of the world's global population, with over 500 million farms and 2 billion people relying on these small holdings. So this map here shows the distribution of smallholder farms and rangeland that are used to support many of these livelihoods across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Yeah, and I tend to think about the context of smallholder livelihoods and climate change in these conservation landscapes. And this is in part because I've trained as an ecologist. I have the word ecology in all of my degrees, even though I don't see myself as an ecologist because of, you know, the changing nature of my research. But I'm still very committed to kind of broad goals of ecology and conservation. And so I often work with smallholder communities living in conservation landscapes, which I think of as generally a landscape identified by some entity or some group or some community as important for biodiversity conservation that may be threatened by global environmental and anthropogenic changes. These landscapes often have communities that are heavily directly dependent on natural resources, along with wildlife and ecosystem functions that might be also dependent on natural processes. And so there's this heavy dependence and this heavy interlinkage between humans and environmental and ecological processes that are also directly impacted by these global change processes. I'm currently doing research in three, actually I guess four if I think about it, conservation landscapes. The first is the Maputaland Albany Pondoland Biodiversity Hotspot in Southern Africa, which includes regions of South Africa, Mozambique, and Eswatini, formerly Swaziland. And I'll present some work from that shortly. And the second is the Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, or KAZA. This region is well known for its large elephant population and is really critical for elephant conservation in Africa. And finally, the third one, where I'll also present some data from this region as well, is the East African, or the East Albertine or East Afro-Montane Biodiversity Hotspot, which is well known for its bird and primate diversity and also high population density of communities that are heavily dependent on the environment. So within each of these contexts, much of my work is at the intersection of climate change, human interactions with the environment, climate adaptation or adaptation to changing environmental conditions, and human health and well-being, which is really paramount in the work that I do. And so broadly, my motivation is to understand these relationships between climate change, smallholder adaptation, well-being, and human environment interactions, and their implications for social environmental systems broadly in these conservation landscapes. So the title of my talk includes the term social capital. In my work, I'm often focused on the role and the value of people, social networks, and social resources to support sustainable natural resource use, resilience, adaptation, and really to better understand some of the drivers of these human environment interactions. We tend to focus on social capital because we have seen and really observe the critical role that it can play, particularly among vulnerable communities that are heavily influenced by some of these global climate changes. So now I'll move into two case studies where I talk a bit about the role of social capital in our understanding. So I'll illustrate this link between climate change adaptation and human environment interactions with the first case study from Eswatini, formerly Swaziland. They changed their name in 2018. And the goal really was to understand how climate change was impacting livelihoods and what the response to these impacts were. For those who don't know, Eswatini is a small country in Southern Africa. About 75% of the population are smallholder farmers. Average incomes are relatively low, annually ranging between 300 and 2,500 in terms of actual gained income. And rainfall varies pretty significantly across the landscape, but and is quite low in some regions when we're thinking about the capacity for rain-fed farming as a livelihood. As I mentioned, Eswatini is in this Maputaland, Pondoland, Albany biodiversity hotspot. And for me, understanding, and for many who are sort of concerned about the broader function of the hotspot and the capacity of it to support biodiversity, understanding the nature of these human environment interactions and what environmentally dependent households do when they're under threat in such biodiverse landscape is really critical for both human health and well-being and biodiversity conservation. So Eswatini is also experiencing significant and increasingly severe impacts from climate change, including one of the most severe droughts in recent memory between 2015 and 2016. So during that time, precipitation fell to below 65% of averages, and maize yields declined to less than half, as shown in this figure here, with maize output declining from around 80,000 tons to less than 40,000 tons. So really severe drought-related impacts in terms of food production. Declines in water and degradation of grazing land as a result also led to tens of thousands of cattle dying, which, as I'm sure many of you know, the role of cattle for both livelihood support and also cultural relevance is really important in these regions. And then also, as this headline from a newspaper in Swaziland shows, many students were attending school just to get access to food, and that wasn't available at home as a result of this severe drought. So I was in Eswatini in 2015 and 2016 and had the opportunity to understand how people were responding to drought and what they were doing in response to it. And so to operationalize this response to drought, this adaptation to drought, I borrow from the idea of adaptive capacity, which is the ability to effectively respond to or take advantage of change and changing environments. And to measure this, borrowing from the Sustainable Rural Livelihoods framework, we hypothesize that adaptive capacity is driven by access to and quality of these 5 types of capital: physical, financial, natural, human, and social capital. I'll briefly go over each of those. So physical capital refers to access to local infrastructure, roads, hospitals, and then household durable assets, things like buildings, tractors, access to technology. Financial capital refers to household wealth and includes access to loans, startup capital, income from employment, and small businesses. Social capital, as I said, refers to the extent to which individuals are involved in local social networks. And there are many different forms of it. We think about bridging social capital and linking social capital, which influences kind of who you're connected to within your community and beyond your community. But I also make this distinction between structured and unstructured social capital, which in unstructured can include things like communicating or trading with neighbors or other community members, or more structured social capital or social networks, such as working for or hiring neighbors, where there's a more structured relationship, or participating in community organizations, for example. Natural capital encompasses kind of the availability and quality of local natural areas and the resources they provide: farmland, grazing land, water, forests, and all the sort of living things that they support. And then finally, human capital, which is heavily linked to social capital, encompasses kind of the skills, knowledge, experience that people have, things like education, training, that kind of support a lot of these activities. And so a broadly prevailing hypothesis is that increased availability and access to any type of capital improves overall adaptive capacity. But it's not always clear, and it varies from context to context, if one type of capital might be more important in increasing overall adaptive capacity. And really, ideally, if we want to improve adaptation to climate change and to changing environmental conditions, identifying if one type of capital is more important than others is really critical to efficient intervention strategies and supporting the most efficient and resilient strategies in the future. So to do this, I combined, and with the sort of the research team I was working with, qualitative and quantitative social science data methods to understand how households were experiencing this drought and how they were responding to it. So in focus groups, we discussed things like community history, how is the climate change, what are the various economic trends that are being experienced in the region, what are the organizations that are operating, what's the nature of community leadership. We then asked about adaptation options, right? What do people do when there's drought? What do people do when there's a loss of crops or loss of traditional livelihoods, historically and currently? We also did some participatory mapping exercises to get a sense of what are the relationships to the natural environment, what natural resources are available locally, and how has the landscape changed? And then also get a sense of the population growth and movement in and out of various communities. Based on all this, we generated a household survey to get a better sense of this idea of adaptive capacity. So who's living in a household, what are the demographics, right? This gives us a sense of human capital. And then measuring things like durable assets, asking people what they have access to get a sense of all the other types of capital that might be available. And then really focusing in on this idea of adaptation. In response to the most recent drought that many households were experiencing, what have you done? What have you changed? How have you adapted? And then really importantly, do you perceive it as successful? Was it successful in increasing either food consumption, income, or agricultural output? Things that are really critical, particularly during times of drought when traditional or normal livelihood strategies might be less viable. So based on these focus groups and preliminary research, these were the suite of indicators that we used for each type of capital that could be quantitatively measured and used in our statistical models. There's a lot here, so I'll just focus in on one as an example. With natural capital, for example, capital, we asked each household to quantify their most recent crop harvest in terms of kilograms, the amount of farmland they owned, if they're collecting wild foods of any kind, how often, how much, how far they're traveling to do so, use of fuel wood on the landscape and other natural resources, and livestock owned. Because if anybody's interested, all of these variables are highly correlated. So we use ordination methods, specifically principal components analysis, to condense these variables into metrics for use in our statistical model. I won't go into that a ton now. So going into a little bit of the results here, I've been kind of vaguely discussing adaptation. So I wanted to give you a sense of kind of what people said they were doing. So the most common adaptation was kind of modifying existing farming strategies. So planting drought or heat resistant crops or cash crops. So things like cash crops included cotton, wheat, sorghum, sunflower, mushrooms in a few cases, and also changing the timing of farming to respond to changes in rainfall. Additionally, conservation farming and strategies that have been kind of shared within communities to support soil moisture retention to minimize soil erosion and soil degradation. So things like crop rotation and keeping plant material on the farmland when not farming. Additionally, looking for off-farm work, right? So often this meant moving from the more rural areas where we were doing research to the bigger cities, either in Eswatini or, for instance, in South Africa to look for work. Raising chickens to sell, raising chickens either to sell directly or for their eggs was another common adaptation. Selling crafts and selling natural resources, and often that went hand in hand. So collecting things like grass to make baskets that can then be sold locally. Participating in local organizations to gain access to resources, knowledge, training, etc. And then beekeeping was one interesting natural resource-based livelihood that a few households tried, but was generally not especially successful. So looking directly at the link between adaptation and adaptation success and capital, we found that adaptation is positively associated with capital diversity. That is the spread of households' capital across the 5 different types of capital. So this figure here shows kind of idealized data to show the difference between a diverse set of capital in green, that's sort of evenly spread across the 5 types, and a non-diverse capital with one type dominating. And then these regression data show a positive relationship between capital diversity and the number of adaptations that a household attempted, showing a positive relationship between the two. So as capital diversity, right, the spread of capital across the 5 types increased, households were more able to attempt different types of adaptation. Honing in on that more specific question about which one, if any, might be more important among the different types of capital, we found that social capital was most strongly, surprise, surprise, given the title of my talk, was most strongly correlated with adaptation attempts and adaptation success. So this figure here shows standardized beta coefficients, which are an indicator of the strength of a particular variable on the outcome variable. And social capital here has the largest non-overlapping 0 coefficient, indicating that it has the strongest relationship with adaptation attempts here. Again, so households that had more social capital were more likely to attempt multiple adaptations in response to the drought. Natural capital was also positively associated with adaptation, but the relationship wasn't quite as strong. Zooming a little bit more, we also found that this structured social capital, in particular, working for or hiring neighbors, and that's sort of taking into account the extra money that might be involved in that interaction, but just having a structured ongoing relationship with people beyond your household and participating in community organizations, again, attempting to account for any additional resources that might be other types of capital, were associated with adaptation success. So this figure here shows an index of structured social capital and the probability of having any successful adaptation, and there's a positive relationship. So households that had structured social relationships with others were both more likely to attempt adaptations and were more likely to have an adaptation that they viewed as successful in terms of improving their livelihoods during this drought. So what we can conclude here, at least based on that data, is that social capital is really critical to adaptation and adaptation success, and in particular, this idea of structured social capital. In particular, households said that it established and strengthened their pathways for exchange of information, for opportunities, for learning about other types of adaptations, for learning how to engage in certain adaptations, and also access to other types of capital. I want to do this adaptation, but I don't have this durable asset that I need. I need access to a tractor, right? So these structured social networks enabled people to gain access to other types of capital as well. So increasing structured social capital, I think, is critical to enabling future adaptation to climate change and changing environmental conditions more broadly. So this includes things like creating and devoting more resources to existing community organizations, where possible, providing capital to these organizations to kind of strengthen that access to other resources, and searching for new opportunities to bridge and link households in structured ways. I think this is generally perceived as exciting news for those working to understand and support climate adaptation. Communities in Eswatini and similar rural areas across low and middle income countries are often quite rich in social capital and have great potential to grow these structured social capital networks. Strong networks already exist between neighbors, church groups, schools that can be tapped into to help people as climate change becomes more of an issue. And while this wasn't an explicit focus of this work, it's worth noting that communities with stronger social networks were less likely to report degradation and fragmentation of the surrounding natural landscape and the surrounding savanna habitat. And they were more confident in the sustainability of their livelihoods and the natural resources on which they depend. And they tended to express a greater appreciation for local wildlife and their potential, the potential of local wildlife to improve their livelihoods. So that's definitely a direction that requires more research, but was really interesting finding and a positive one. So I'll shift here from talking about the nature of social capital and adaptation in Eswatini to another instance trying to link social capital to sustainable livelihoods. So after gaining some of these really interesting insights and data related to adaptation and social capital, we wanted to learn a little bit more about the way that social networks support both human livelihoods and broader conservation goals. So this case study is from Uganda in the Albertine Rift, and specifically around Windy Impenetrable National Forest, shown here. And Windy is really well known for being one of the last remaining homes of the mountain gorillas. So the region is really important for wildlife conservation. The region surrounding Windy is also really important for sustainable rural livelihoods and livelihoods in general. In the past few decades, there have been a huge increase in local populations around the park, leading to really high population densities in the region. And this is in part due to the really fertile volcanic soils that are present in the region. This increase in population has led to the threat of, if not the reality of, increased pressure on the landscape and increased concerns surrounding food insecurity, as well as potential illegal resource extraction from within the park. So this figure here shows the really sharp forest boundary on the landscape, where basically the farms end and the protected area, Windy Impenetrable National Park, begins. So a key consideration in the region is, like I said, this kind of tension between the needs of local communities and these conservation goals. And that's kind of a trend in much of the research that I'm engaged in. Historically, communities living in this region have been highly dependent on forest resources, timber, firewood, medicinal plants, forest wildlife. And when the park became established, and as the population continues to grow outside the park, right, they've lost access to these forest resources. And in response to the need for forest products, and in response to kind of changing economic markets more broadly, there's been this increase in planting trees outside of the protected areas. So these plots, which I call woodlots, often called woodlots, represent a really important adaptation strategy for changing livelihoods in the environment. So folks will plant these, as you can see here. These are primarily pine and eucalyptus, and these are planted within kind of the existing land that's used for farming. and households can rely on these woodlots for some of the forest products that they would need. So where does social capital come in? In Windy, there are these really interesting and local social organizations known as stretcher groups or stretcher societies. These stretcher groups were first formed due to the really steep terrain, at least in part due to the steep terrain in the region and limited access to medical care. Because the terrain is so steep, and I'm really trying to show you images of the steep terrain, like it is steep. I was struggling walking around there last October. Um, it's steep and it's high in the mountains. So because it's steep and because it's often rainy throughout the year, it's a really moist environment. Stretcher groups have emerged as a way to transport the sick, the infirm, the deceased from homes to hospitals or for funerals, hence the term stretcher. Most households in the region's membership in stretcher group is assumed and involves paying dues and attending meetings. Stretcher groups, which formed out of a clear necessity of the environment, right? This steep landscape and lack of access to cars, and even when you have cars, the roads are often hard to get through when it's wet. Um, these organizations have evolved to be really important for local governance, conflict management, and arbitration. So these are organizations that play both natural resource management roles and kind of broader social and societal roles. Um, the research question, at least one of the research questions we wanted to ask is, how does access to woodlots support local livelihoods? And really, are there differences in access to privately owned and stretcher group owned woodlots? So these stretcher groups own woodlots, and private individuals can own woodlots. All of the woodlots in general support access to forest resources that households would depend on. Um, and I think more broadly, given this context of forest-dependent communities living in a biodiversity hotspot, and stretcher groups as a local institution, a local social institution, it's a really great opportunity to again look at the role of social networks and social capital to support livelihoods and broader conservation goals. So working in 12 communities outside of Windy, shown here, we conducted focus groups and household surveys to, again, get a sense of demographics, livelihood strategies, forest product needs, right? So what wood are you actually using? Where are you getting it from? And how is your livelihood being impacted as a result? Engagement with local stretcher groups. So how involved are you? How do you perceive this as valuable or not valuable for your livelihood? And then also the nature of the woodlots themselves in terms of what they are and what they're providing. So the main resources that households are using woodlots for are building materials like timber and poles, and energy such as firewood and charcoal. And these are basically all of the wood products that households need and have access to. And these products support both daily on-farm activities and off-farm economic strategies. So this figure here is actually showing sales of what households are harvesting from places like woodlots and other places where they might access wood products, and then able to sell to support their livelihoods and off-farm activities. We also asked a more broader question to understand how households were supported or not. And that is, are you able to meet your household wood product needs? So the things that your household needs on a daily basis in terms of wood, are you able to access it? And 70% of households said they were able to meet their wood product needs, and 30% were not. When we look at stretcher groups, we found that while stretcher groups are really important, 98% of households are involved in stretcher groups in some way. These are organizations that have been around for a long time and are really embedded into the functioning of communities. And that we found that 70% of stretcher groups actually own their own woodlots and manage their own woodlots. But we did find that most households are sourcing their daily wood products, so what I need to cook dinner tonight, for example, from privately owned woodlots and not from stretcher group owned woodlots. We found that stretcher group owned woodlots serve needs related to their founding, which kind of makes sense. They're often used to sell timber to pay for emergencies, to construct coffins, and to build community structures. And so It's this resource that is managed by a social institution that also supports broader social goals, right? As opposed to individual daily livelihood activity, which isn't really that surprising, is also a little surprising. um, and accordingly, since daily household wood needs are not generally sourced from stretcher group owned woodlots, we found that having access to stretcher group owned woodlots was not really important for this question of, are you able to get the wood that you need regularly? So this figure here shows households, I think these are backwards. Yes, these are backwards. So pink is actually households that are able to meet their wood product needs, and blue is households that are not. And the first two columns or set of columns show households that have access to private woodlots only and access to stretcher woodlots and private woodlots. And you see that there's essentially no difference, right? The number of households that are able to get the wood products they need doesn't change when you add access to a stretcher group owned woodlot. The second two columns, the columns sets 3 and 4, are households that have access to stretcher group owned woodlots only, and households that have no woodlot access. And again, there's very little difference, I mean, in between those two, right? So those groups tend to be less likely to meet their wood product needs because they don't have access to private woodlots. Um, and so that kind of exemplifies the role that stretcher groups and stretcher group owned woodlots play in terms of livelihoods. Um, so despite this finding that stretcher group owned woodlots don't necessarily support daily wood product needs, we did learn some other important roles that they play. So stretcher groups provide really important experience managing woodlots. Members of stretcher groups are often asked to prune and manage, right, and go in and weed and chop down things when it's time to sell, right. So they're getting this experience on how woodlots could potentially be managed that can then be translated into their own privately managed woodlots. It also really supports broader social networks and supports livelihood activities. So it's similar to the Eswatini case, right? Folks that are involved in this structured social network have access to community members, have access to resources, to knowledge, et cetera. Many folks said that the stretcher groups are really critical for conflict mediation, and in particular natural resource conflict mediation, which is important again in a landscape where we're concerned about natural resource degradation. And again, similar to the Eswatini case, this resource during times of stress, right? When families are faced with emergencies, when there's a death in the community, when the community needs to come together to build something, these stretcher groups and these stretcher group owned woodlots play that important role. And then we didn't directly measure this, but we have gotten some sort of anecdotal data, I guess, that the stretcher groups provide kind of an important layer of governance below like a local chairman that provides some strength to negotiate beyond the community and in building and strengthening relationships with the national park. So in terms of advocating for community needs, in terms of advocating for more equitable relationships, in terms of how Windy and Impenetrable National Park is being managed, these stretcher groups can potentially serve as a collective organization to advocate for individuals. So kind of wrapping up, when I talk about social capital and the relationships between social capital and livelihoods, these are some of the key findings. Household access to capital, in particular social capital, supports adaptation behavior, which is really critical as we think about how environments are changing. Social networks, while really important, don't necessarily provide all livelihood resources, which shouldn't be that surprising. And really importantly, when we think about meeting both conservation goals and human needs in these complex conservation landscapes, it requires consideration of these complex human environment interactions. All right, I don't have a ton of time left, but I do want to switch gears here to talk a little bit about some of my work related to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in STEM. In part because, especially this year, people are really interested in hearing about this work, but also because I'm seeking to actually broaden my network of collaborators in this space. And because I really think it sort of fundamentally links to this idea of social capital and human capital, right? The folks that we have working in a space, the nature of the networks that support research in a space is really critical to the importance, to sort of how that field progresses, I guess, more broadly. Um, so I just shared this article because a colleague of mine wrote it, and it's kind of a really interesting example of one of the seemingly benign ways in which there's structural racism and structural kind of marginalization that operates in the sort of the fields of science that we work in. And so this article is focused on the fact that everyone doesn't have a last name, right? Like that's not always the case. And sometimes you literally can't submit an article without filling in a space that says last name. um, the impacts of structural racism in our fields take many forms, leading to underrepresentation, uneven power dynamics, cultural taxation, burdens of service. But one that's perhaps hardest for people to grasp who haven't experienced it is this extreme level of isolation that accompanies it. As an ecologist and environmental scientist, I often find myself the only Black person in the room and often the only person of color in the room. And this figure here highlights some of the trends in terms of doctoral degrees awarded in STEM over a 15-year period. Um, and there hasn't been much of an increase or a change. And this is numbers, but when you look at actually proportions, relative proportion to the population, similar disproportionate trends. Focusing a little bit more in the environmental fields, because that's where I work, and also beyond academia, because I'm very interested in engaging with practitioners in my work. There's been a lot of research done on what's been termed the green ceiling. And much of this work has been done by Dorceta Taylor at University of Michigan. He found that despite decades of kind of promises to diversify the conservation and environmental fields, these efforts are really falling short. And so you can see here, this is kind of the proportion of people of color who are interns, staff that are recent hires, leadership and board slots in various types of environmental organization, NGOs, government agencies, and foundations. Some of the main challenges associated with this trend are unconscious bias, discrimination, insular recruiting, and then workplace climate and culture. But it really goes well beyond the challenge of getting people into the fields. Once there, folks who are underrepresented can often feel unsafe and unwelcomed. So I'm currently doing research with environmental scientists and conservationists of color to learn more about their experiences. And I want to share a quote because I think it's a powerful one from a recent article we published about a student's experience conducting ecological field research. The word was only said once, but it echoed in her ears. She heard stories of the word thrown at others, including her parents, but the word was never used towards her, the N-word. It felt like a punch to the gut. She looked around to her peers and saw blank faces. She immediately began to question her decision regarding this work. Is this my new normal? Can I survive the field season when so much pain was inflicted on the first day? She thought back to her childhood, watching Steve Irwin on television with an infectious smile and bright optimism. She dreamt of being like him, traversing the outdoors to see all of the wondrous animals. Yet Steve Irwin did not look like her, nor did her peers. Many people of color that I know, and as I'm doing this research with colleagues to understand some of these experiences, folks have experienced overt and explicit racism, as in this instance, and microaggressions simply because they're existing in these spaces while doing their science. That was an incident that happened out east, but to kind of bring it home in Colorado, the outdoors and science in the outdoors doesn't always feel safe. Coloradans in particular have such a meaningful relationship with their environment and such a commitment to it. It's exciting to come here and do research. But cultural norms often make the space unwelcoming. Many young environmentalists of color have shared with me some of their experiences being judged for not having the right gear to be considered legit. Another Black woman I know, who's also Muslim, shared with me how she was made fun of and othered for wanting to maintain a level of hygiene that was not seen as outdoorsy enough. So among many in this state and in other regions where environment is held in high regard, there's this narrow view of what a relationship with the environment means that makes it hard to work for those that don't view this, who don't fit that view, entering this workforce. And so what we're finding as we do this highly qualitative research at this stage is that many people of color had similar experiences to those that I've just described. It might be presumed that they are only there because they fit a certain demographic, or that they don't have the same skills or the same meaningful relationship with the environment. And we're finding that often one of two things seems to happen. Either they leave the field and they go somewhere where they aren't the only one and where they won't just be seen as a certain way, or they stay and attempt to fix it and make it better for those who are like them or those who might come after them. They attempt to take on the task of making the experience better. And some of the folks we've talked to have described feelings of feeling like a martyr for the cause of justice and equity and diversity in STEM, which isn't ideal for recruiting our best. I am low on time, so I'm going to skip this. The point that I'm primarily trying to make here, and this is related to some work that I'm doing in terms of basically in academic settings, how the work that we do or how representation changes amongst different sort of levels of this higher academic hierarchy within which we exist. And then also the nature of intersectional relationships, right? All of us operate and exist in different positionalities, and we're perceived in different ways. So this figure is showing, is primarily focused on gender, and I include this Kimberly Crenshaw quote, who coined the term intersectionality: "When they enter, we all enter," to really highlight the fact that we all exist in different demographics, different states, different identities. And when we make spaces equitable and inclusive for the most marginalized and oppressed amongst us, we all benefit. Yep, I'm gonna skip this. Cool research showing that the types of questions you ask influence whether or not it's likely to be perceived as impactful. So when scientists of color tend to focus on interventions, for example, as opposed to purely biological processes, they're often less likely to be funded by institutions like the NIH. I talk a little bit about myself here as an example of this idea of infusing humanity in the science we do. I started off my research as an ecologist. And I really loved the environment and I really loved animals, but it wasn't until I was actually in Eswatini doing dissertation research that I realized I love human environment interactions as much as I love studying the environment. And so I'm really on this crusade to encourage us to think about people when we think about STEM. And my suspicion is that amongst folks in the Africa Center, this probably isn't as much of a challenge as it is for other folks in biology, for example. And then I'll just end here by kind of talking about some of the research I'm doing in this space. I'm currently investigating the invisibility of certain groups, regions, demographics, and populations when we talk about climate research and its implications on climate policy. I'm looking at the prevalence of unpaid positions in environmental and ecological research and how that serves as a barrier to disadvantaged and underrepresented groups. And then recently started very selfishly for myself as an assistant professor, looking at the relationship between race and gender and time spent doing research, teaching, and service, and what that means for success in academia. So broadly, this work I think fits into my research focused on basically the resilience of the field and social capital and social networks and human capital within this field, and what that means for success of conservation and success of human environment interactions research more broadly. And there are some cool pictures.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. There's so much here. It was fantastic. It was fantastic. But I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, who is going to handle the questions.
Yeah, Karen, can you see the chat box? There's a few questions in there right now. Yeah. I may let you take a look at them. Some of them are a little lengthy and probably easier for you to tackle if you read them.
Yeah. So to Richard's question, right, it's a great question because there's lots of ways to describe drought, and there's like, there's the kind of biophysical definition of drought. There's one that's specifically related to whatever crop you're growing. And then there's one that's perception based, right? And so this, because I was focused on folks' response to drought, it was primarily their perception. And I also asked a lot of kind of social psychological questions about how are you actually perceiving the drought, and how do you gain information about when there's drought? Is it from your neighbors? Is it from community members? Is it from the radio? Is it from extension agents, right? But it was very much kind of a perception. What do you see as drought, or how are you perceiving the drought? Is there a drought happening, and what's your response to it? But in the case of the Eswatini drought, the biophysical indicators were all there. As I said, rainfall fell to below 65% of like century level averages. So it was quite low. Oh, yes. Okay. So yeah, I think Sue's question is kind of acknowledging the fact that any barrier to doing research effectively, right, which might include the requirement to have a last name, or might be the prevalence of underpaid or under or unpaid research positions, or the fact that if you go out into the, if you go out into the forest to do your research, you feel othered in some way, as with the case of my friend that I mentioned. All of these are going to limit your capacity to do research, collect data, submit articles, right, and hit all of the various metrics for success by which we are judged, particularly as academics. And this is particularly where I talk about this idea of feeling like a martyr for a cause. The reason I'm doing, a large part of the reason I am doing this research related to Jedi and STEM is so it won't detract from all of the things by which I'm judged, right? I can still publish on this while moving the field forward. I can still potentially get grants on this while moving the field forward. And right, but I'm lucky that I've been able to do that, and I've been able to be hired as an assistant professor saying, okay, I study human environment interactions, I study climate change and climate adaptation, and I study Jedi and STEM. So any work that I do related to Jedi and STEM is going to allow me to be successful theoretically in the academic system within which I work. But yeah, I think it speaks to some of the challenges associated with doing Jedi work. It's often undervalued, it's treated as volunteer work, and it can detract from overall success. There's like several questions here. I'm reading Bethy's question. Oh, Bethy, we can talk later. Okay. No, this is a great question. Tendency of controversy. Yeah, okay. So I think there's a few questions there in Bethy's questions focus on this idea of structured and unstructured social capital. I think the key point is they're both bottom up and top down, right? So there are community led organizations and individual led organizations that are operating to support adaptation or support training or support access to resources. And then there's like, USAID or some nature conservancy or some local conservancy has come in and said, we want to train you on how to turn this natural resource into a craft, or we want to do small business training to support resilience. And I think with both the sort of bottom up and the top down structures, they're structured, right? People are meeting regularly. People understand their relationships to others within the structure. People know that it's an organization that they can count on, but it also, because it's structured, it can be linked to broader conservation related initiatives that are happening. So we want to ensure that we're protecting biodiversity, or we want to minimize shrub encroachment, or we want to afforest this region. How can we work with these existing organizations to both support livelihoods and support the nature of these organizations while achieving conservation goals? All right, Sue's asking the tough questions. What do you feel would be the single best thing that we can all do to enhance diversity in STEM? I think a lot of the conversations that are happening this year, and like I said, I've added this piece into my talk because people want to hear about it now more than ever. I think a key thing that we should all be doing in our teaching, our research, our service, our interactions within and beyond the university is acknowledging how the structures within which we operate can support structural racism, right? So often when I go and do research internationally, I'm constantly struggling with the fact that the research structures within which I operate are inherently colonial, right? And we're set up to often for theft of knowledge to benefit European researchers and not Africans, for example. So the acknowledgement of that and any steps that I take to mitigate that is a crucial step in that direction. And similarly, when I think about how I am judged as an academic within an academic R1 institution, I know that it doesn't actually lend itself to building meaningful relationships with communities and ensuring that my research has impact. But acknowledging that means that I can take it a step further and figure out ways to do that effectively. When we're teaching, a few weeks ago, we were introducing our students to the chi-squared test statistic. And we just mentioned how a lot of the statistics that we use are racist, right? They were used by early statisticians to genetically justify differences between the races and the ideas that some races were inferior to others, right? And heavily tied to the eugenics movement. That wasn't to say students don't use the chi-squared test, right? Because at its basic, it's just math and we can use math. But it is to say, these are the ways that oppression and racism are embedded in the work that we do foundationally. And acknowledging that allows us to think more critically about how to do it. So I don't know, that's how I tend to think about how we can all take steps to move this forward. Yeah, really great question from Reka. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. So yeah, adaptation and climate adaptation in particular it can be a lengthy process, right? It's inherently an adaptive process. Let's try something, see if it works. If it does work, we'll stick with it. If it doesn't work, we'll move on. But I think you bring up a really good point that as climate change happens more intensely and severely and rapidly, this lengthy process of adaptation becomes a lot more challenging. And so an ideal scenario, and this is again why I go back to structured social capital, is adaptive adaptation. And I don't know if that actually makes sense, but that's sort of the way I think about it, is having a structure within which to say, I'm going to try this thing. If and when it doesn't work, I'm going to come back to you, share my resources, my knowledge, my experience, get some help if I'm unable to feed my family, and figure out the next step. And when you're working within a community, when you're working within a structure, right, you can do that more efficiently and more effectively and with less risk, right? There's this safety net embedded if we're all working together and we're all trying to do that. Also, obviously, state level, right, and government level structures that also support safety nets are really critical as well. Oh, that's a good question, Stacy. I think, so the nature of climate adaptation in particular in the US is different, well, depending on who you talk to. I often, and increasingly as I move my research domestically, I'm really interested and eager to work with indigenous communities in the US, because actually many of the challenges faced in those communities are similar to the ones where I've been working in Southern and East Africa. So I think, we use the term adaptive management when we think about how we manage natural resource systems here in the US. And it's a similar process of try a thing, hope it happens, include science and local knowledge where relevant and applicable, and then adapt it. And I think the capacity of inclusive social networks to do that is similar here in the US as it is in the case studies, for example, that I mentioned. So yeah, I guess that's a simple answer. Really great questions, everyone. Yeah, so Taylor is asking a great question about top-down or bottom-up organizations in terms of their effectiveness in moving toward these goals. I think it's important. So social networks are important everywhere. And right here in the US, social networks might allow you to get a job or get into a graduate degree program. In Eswatini, they might allow you to eat. And so the nature of social networks becomes more important, where the nature of sort of bottom up social networks and bottom up organization often is more critical when there's a lack of top down safety nets. So I think my hope is that increased top down structures that support access to capital, access to resources, access to knowledge, shift the role of bottom up organizations, right? So if you have a social safety net that provides you with sort of the baseline and slightly above the baseline things that we need to survive in changing environmental landscapes, then these bottom up organizations can play different roles in terms of potentially more innovative or more risky adaptations, where if they fail, you're not necessarily going to lose all of your crop and starve. And if you do, right, there's some top-down structure that still supports you all the same. So a top-down, for the context, like a Southern African context, in Eswatini, for example, the organizations that are providing sacks of maize and oil, and that might be government, that also might be USAID, that are making sure that people have the absolute bare minimum. And those are stronger in some areas than they are in others. And similarly in the US, right, unemployment is a really great example of a top-down organization that supports adaptation and supports responding to changing environmental and economic conditions. Yeah, and then, yeah, I think the most government or intergovernmental organizations that are moving or supporting change in local communities would qualify as top-down. All right.
I think we have like 1 minute, but Karen, I have a question, and that you've sort of just answered the question in your work in especially in Eswatini. You talk about the social networks that occur at the local level, and my question was, are there links to beyond the local level that actually enhance or help people to increase their social capital so that they can cope with these climate change events? Or is it primarily just occurring at the local level?
Mm-hmm. Both. Yeah, so there's a lot happening at the local level, but there is, right, so I worked in 6 communities, so within communities, there are lots of organizations that are only operating within those communities. But there are several organizations that are operating between communities and provide that kind of, wait, I always get confused if it's bridging or linking. It's bridging? Oh my God.
Bridging is up.
And out. Okay.
Yeah.
God, the social capital that moves beyond kind of the individuals that you know and interact with on a daily basis to folks in other communities, for example, who might be engaged in other types of activities. So the simple answer is that both are happening. It was more common in my experience in Eswatini to see mostly within communities, especially from the bottom up. The ones that were operating between communities were more top down, and like I said, run by a larger conservancy organization that might have international or multinational work going on. Thanks, everyone. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. I think everybody's thanking you now. And thank you so much. This was absolutely inspiring. Your research on all fronts, both in Africa and on issues of STEM and color. I think there's a right now is a wonderful time to be engaging and really questioning that and moving forward in that area. So I just want to thank you so much. There's so much to think about and to contemplate in regard to your talk. So thank you so very much.
Thanks so much for having me. Would love to connect with folks. Find me, let's chat, let's collaborate.